I'll be recording the session, and we'll post this on the MGI YouTube channel soon. Again, good evening and welcome to the World GIS Day celebration for the University of Maine System. My name is Tony Guay. I'm the chair of the Maine Geospatial Institute, as well as a remote sensing specialist and educator at the Wheatland Geospatial Lab in the School of Forest Resources at the University of Maine. Tonight, we join thousands of people around the globe celebrating World GIS Day as we talk about geospatial science and technology. We're reliant on geospatial technology for ordinary everyday activities, like asking our phones for directions or checking the weather. And so are many businesses, industries, and agencies that make critical decisions about things like natural resource management, climate change, mitigation and adaptation, security, healthcare, transportation, and much more. Over the past few years, the University of Maine System has been building a central geospatial resource for campuses, agencies, industry, and communities in Maine. This resource is the Maine Geospatial Institute, or MGI. Tonight's events are hosted by MGI, and I'd like to thank the member campuses of the Institute, the University of Maine at Augusta, Farmington, Fort Kent, Machias, Presque Isle, as well as the University of Maine in Orono and the University of Southern Maine in Portland. We have attendees from all corners of the state of Maine with us tonight, and we welcome you. Tonight, we are pleased to offer 3 student lightning talks from 3 of our campuses, showing GIS in action, one representing an undergraduate project, one representing a master's project, and one representing a PhD project. Following the viewing of these talks, there will be a moderated discussion with students as they share more about their work and their interest in applying GIS in real-world projects. Our moderator this evening is Andy Smith-Petersen, chair of the Maine GIS User Group, a certified GIS professional, and University of Southern Maine alumnus. Welcome, Andy, and thank you for moderating this session. If you have any questions during tonight's panel, please type them in the chat and we'll get to as many of them as possible. With that, I'll turn it over to Andy.
Thank you for that introduction, Tony, and thanks everybody for coming tonight. I'm going to show our panelists' videos. It'll just be a few minutes, and then we'll be back to speak with them all. So enjoy these, and we'll see you in a few minutes.
Hello, everyone. My name is James A. Dobbs. I am a senior at University of Maine, Presque Isle. Enrolled in the Environmental Science and Sustainability Bachelor's Natural Resources and Environmental Science concentration program. I love everything outdoors related, so a E&V BS was the best choice for me. And I'm finding that Arcgis 1 and GIS 2 is a fun course to take and participate in. The GIS project is Reed Cemetery. It's a great community service project. Reed Cemetery is located in Wytopitlock, Maine, southern Aroostook County. Wytopitlock is a small village in Reed Plantations Township. The cemetery is off the side of Route 171. The project was requested by the town manager since several years ago. The reason for the request was due to the town only having a hand-drawn map, which is hard to read. The town needs a real map so the officials can use to manage the cemetery. This project is to create a cemetery lot shapefile. Once it is created, a digital map can be generated for use with Google Earth, and a hard copy map can be printed. It would also allow for easy periodical updates as needed. I'm excited about this GIS project. because it is not just about being behind a computer working with GIS programs. It's about going out in the field and collecting data using cutting edge technologies and then creating maps with Arcgis. Aerial photography using a DJI drone. This is a high resolution drone aerial photo of the Reed Cemetery that was going to be used as a base map for on-screen digitizing of the lots. Using Trimble GPS, GEO or Geo 7X to map control points for georeferencing drone aerial photo. This is me taking a coordinates of the landmarks using the Trimble Geo 7X. Several landmarks, headstones around the margin of the cemetery were mapped and their coordinates were recorded. The data would be used for georeferencing the drone aerial image. The georeferenced aerial photo and the lot map created with on-screen digitizing method. This is a georeferenced drone aerial photo using the georeferencing tool. Tool orientates the photo to its real-world coordinates by using the control points. The photo was then used as a base map for on-screen digitizing. The green dots are the control points that were mapped using the Trimble Geo 7X GPS. The red lines represent the lots. The cemetery lot map. The lot map, a shapefile, shows the grave owner lots. This project is still a work in progress. The attribute table of the lot, the attribute table of the lot shapefile will be filled with lot owner information once the data is available. This project is started from scratch, from flying a DJI drone from high resolution aerial image, and the image is used as a base map for creating the lot shapefile map with ArcGIS. Trimble GPS was used to map control points for georeferencing the drone aerial image. And it is a great community service project.
Thank you to the Maine Geospatial Institute for putting this event on. Hey everybody, welcome to GIS Day, and thank you to the Maine Geospatial Institute for putting this event on. My name is Izaak Onos. I'm a master's candidate in policy planning and management at the Muskie School of Public Service within the University of Southern Maine. I'm also a recipient of the inaugural Showa Innovation Fellowship for the project I'm going to be talking about. I have a certification in GIS, and one GIS fact related about me. Back as an undergrad in 2016, I did a GIS project studying a potential bike path in the greater Portland area that actually became a basis for state law that was signed by Governor Janet Mills this summer, LD 1370, an act to turn rails into trails. It was really fun to see that project go into fruition. However, today I'm going to be talking about monitoring long-term vegetation change across Kuyata, South Greenland. I work closely with Dr. Kruse, the director of the Muskie School and professor of geography, as well as a colleague, Diana Farrell. Greenland is a massive place. It's actually the largest island in the world at 836,000 square miles. That's about 24 times larger than the state of Maine area-wise. It's dominated by an ice sheet. It's quite barren, and not many people live there. Only about 57,000, all on the southern coast here. Kuyata is the most southern region, right in this red circle. It's a fascinating, dynamic place. It's a newly designated UNESCO World Heritage Site largely stemming from some of the best preserved Viking remnants of a 1000 AD settlement from Eric the Red. It has a fairly robust sheep farming population and industry. Due to the UNESCO status, it's increasing in tourism, and there have been rare minerals found in the area. So there's a lot going on. On top of this, Greenland is quite an understudied place, an undervisited place. And this is important to keep in mind in the realms of climate change, because the Arctic is warming at a faster rate than any other region in the world. So there's significant demand to look into places like Kuyata. This project is a 20-year time series of vegetation analysis. Why 20 years? Well, that is a pretty good amount of time. However, also in remote sensing, back in 2000, certain vegetation-related sensors started to get really good and were launched, including one called MODIS, which this project uses. Why use satellite sensors? Well, there's a lot of them, and they're continuously collecting data around the world, and they can provide a unique way of looking at places that are really hard to get to, and in other ways you probably would never be able to research very well. Why vegetation analysis? Well, vegetation is one of the best land use monitoring techniques. Within the near infrared section of the electromagnetic spectrum, vegetation, green vegetation, shows up really well via reflectance curve. This subsequently can be quantified and can be measured and can be observed over time. So the specific MODIS sensor we're using is MOD 13Q1V006. This provides data generation every 16 days at 250 meter resolution. It already provides something called an NDVI, Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. That is an indicator on a scale of the vigorousness of vegetation, from -1 to +1. Of course, as you get close to +1, that means that it is extremely green. It also provides data for the exact same date each year, pending a leap year where it's shifted by a day. So for this study, we picked a date at the beginning of the growing season, at the height of the growing season, and at the end of the growing season. So not only are we measuring or looking at the NDVI for the same dates each year, but we're looking at each year at different points in the growing season. So there's kind of two levels to it. And we're producing maps like this. So this is Kuyata, and it's dominated by fjords. This gray is nulled out because there's no vegetation there. It's a giant glacier. And the darker the green, the more vigorous the vegetation is. This was captured on July 12, 2020. The yellow is less vigorous, and it's interesting to see. There's certain places that are much more vigorously green than others. So we can compare the same date of any given year. And this is the big, kind of the bookends for this study of July 2020 and July 2000. And you can see some differences, upon quick glance. There's certain areas along the coastline, like right here, if you compare, it seems like the vegetation's expanded a little bit. It's hard to tell in the very dark green areas how much has changed. And this peninsula looks like there's more going on in 2020 than 2000. However, it's quite exhausting and not the best method to just visually compare the two and take down notes. So I've been playing around with a raster calculator technique, which essentially takes the 2000 data and it is subtracted from the 2020 and produces an image like this. So any pixel that shows up as red means that the NDVI number was higher in 2020 than in 2000. And the blue was a number in a pixel in which 2020 was less than 2000. And it's kind of interesting. You know, you can see near the glaciers, there's a significant increase in NDVI. Areas along the coast, you know, there's less. And then, you know, anywhere you look, there's a lot of red, there's some blue. It adds a level of complexity to this story that we're trying to tell and, you know, learn. So for the next steps, I want to further refine this raster calculator technique. Figure out the best intervals. Is 5-year interval good? Is 10-year better? How do we account for years where it's abnormally warm or rainy? Things like that. And figuring out better ways to quantify it as well. You know, another goal is to potentially expand this study, you know, to 20 years earlier as well. We won't be able to have the same quality of data, but it'll be double the amount of time, which will help tell the story better. And of course, hopefully, you know, publish the results, share the results with the locals of Kuyata, and visit. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this.
Hello, my name is Maja Cruz, and I come from Denmark, where I have studied an MA in German studies and geography and geoinformatics. But I'm currently in Orono in Maine, where I'm an interdisciplinary PhD student, and I also work as a research assistant on a research project about the ghettos that were created by the Germans during the Holocaust to incarcerate the Jewish population. And today I'm going to share 2 projects with you that I've been working on for the past year using GIS. The first one is an online Arcgis online platform, a web application that allows users to explore the data that we've been working on the Ghettos project. And I'm just going to share my screen to show you. What you see here is in the western areas, mostly these blue dots, which were SS concentration camps, and in the eastern areas, the ghettos that were made by the Germans to incarcerate Jewish people. There are about 2,300 points in total, and each of them includes some sort of data attached to them. So there are several attributes that can be explored through this platform. You can open, for instance, the Ghettos Filter if you want to know something about ghettos. And here are some categories. Maybe you want to know about restrictions in the ghettos. And you can see some restriction types. Maybe you want to know which kind of labor was performed, and you can select construction or something else. Turn on the filter, and then it highlights the ghettos in which construction was forced labor. You can also combine it with something else, maybe building materials. So now it shows ghettos in which both of those were true. It's also possible to do filtering, which does basically the same thing as, or querying, sorry, it does basically the same thing as filtering, but it creates a new layer. So if we do the same thing here, select construction and building materials and hit apply, then it creates a new layer where you can change the symbology. And it also appears in this layer list here as a new layer now that you can turn on and off. So it's helpful if you want to create different layers that you can compare to each other. And yeah, I think that's what I'm going to say about the platform for now. And I want to turn to the other GIS project that I've been working on, which is a hiding suitability analysis. And so during the Holocaust, there were about 50 to 80,000 Jews who went into hiding in forests to escape from the Germans. That could be from ghettos or from concentration camps, because the woods were often their only option left for survival, but there were only 10% of them who survived the war. So the purpose of my project was to create a model that could predict which areas in the forest were best and worst suited for hiding. And my study area was in present-day Poland. This area, at that time, it was called the Radom district, it was occupied by the Germans, and then they created this district, which was one of 21 in total. In my study area, there were 10 ghettos and a few other perpetrator sites, which just meant that there would be more perpetrator activity. This is what the model ended up looking like. You see on the left here, I have the blue circles are the inputs that I put into the model: forest, settlement, roads, slope, and perpetrator sites. I digitized all of these data inputs from historical maps, and then I needed to feed something into the model. I needed to give it some criteria to work with. And I got those criteria from reading survivor testimonies and memoirs from people who were hid in the forests. And what they told me was that varied or hilly topography was preferred because it offered some natural hiding places. Mixed or deciduous forest was preferred over pine because the leaves could be used to hide evidence of their stay, and it also provided a better undergrowth to hide in. Built environment was a little difficult because the houses where the locals lived were the primary sources of food, but it was also in the same areas that there would be people turning them into the Germans, so they never really knew what would happen, and therefore it was about being close but not too close. And then ghettos and perpetrator sites, of course. So after feeding the model with the criteria that I extracted from the testimonies, I ended up with one final layer that showed or predicted the worst and best suitability, hiding suitabilities. And I displayed it on this final map where yellow areas, forest areas, were the ones that were worst suited for hiding, whereas the blue areas were best suited. And you can clearly see that the northern areas were less suited than the southern areas, because up here we have some roads intersecting the forest. There are also some houses located in here, which were all connected with danger. It was also the flattest area, which was not very good for hiding. It was different in these southern parts because it was very varied and hilly. There were not any roads or any built environment intersecting it and destroying the flow. So yeah, that's what it predicted. And what this model can do is that this is an area where we don't have a lot of sources, because there were not a lot of people surviving, and not all of the survivors also made memoirs. So the other kind of evidence that we have is the actual landscape that we have through the historical maps. So this model uses the landscape also as evidence, and thereby bring the Holocaust down to the ground. So we can use it to fill in gaps where we don't have any sources or survivors, and we can also easily change all of the criteria in the model. It really puts the victim at the center of the analysis, and it shows something about the options that the escapees faced. So my goal for the future is to be able to compare different regions and to find out whether some geographies offered better hiding options than others, but also to include more inputs such as marshes and swamps and rivers, soil types, climatic conditions, and so on, which were all things that changed the life of a forest fugitive. Yes, and that's all I had. Thank you.
And we're back. Thank you all for that great work. James Dobbs, Izaak Onos, Maja Cruz. Pleasure to have you tonight. Let me start with James. I have a question. You mentioned fun in your presentation, and I think that maybe that rings a bell with resonates with folks here on the call who have been doing GIS for a while, maybe. And I'm curious to know if you can talk a little bit about what the best parts of your intro GIS courses have been, and did you have any previous experience with GIS before you got into GIS 1 and GIS 2?
You cut out there for a second, but yeah, no, with GIS, I found that I've enjoyed the hands-on approach with getting data and information that you don't really get if you're just behind a computer, because sometimes being in the field is more informative in my points of views, or at least in my project it was. But the only experience I've had prior would be with mapping I've done when I was a Boy Scout, or mapping in geography, but not much with GIS. Does that kind of answer your question?
Interesting. Yeah. Did you feel that the previous mapping experience you had translated at all, or helped what you're doing today?
It's helped me with a lot of the orientation of the geoplacing and stuff, because I can look at a map on paper and then look at the map on, I think it's right before you geo processing it and to change its orientation. I can look at that and be like, okay, so I have to change this map to the left no matter what I do, and I can already image it in my head before I'm actually done the processing the way it's supposed to be. So it does kind of help having that extra mapping knowledge to go along with the GIS programs and stuff.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious to know, and this is this question for all of the panelists. As you started your journey with GIS, and as you got into the projects that you're working on here, before we get into the projects themselves in a lot of detail, have you had any sort of aha moments as you've gone along where you've learned an analysis, or you learned a tool or a piece of software that kind of clicked with you, and that you recognized as having some broader usefulness? Maybe Izaak, if you want to start on that one.
Yeah, sure. So just to take a quick step back, I have an undergraduate degree in geography. I'm a lifelong geography nerd, and that's definitely what led me into GIS. And I still very much have a love-hate relationship with it. For a GIS 1 project, back as an undergrad 5 years ago, the week that it was due, I had a hard drive fail, and I had to pull like 2 all-nighters, and it just kind of burned me out, and I lost the love. And it took me a couple of years to want to finish my certificate, my Applied GIS certificate and all that. But taking that break was really helpful, because then I got into remote sensing, and combining that has been really rewarding. As an undergrad, I really only, I was primarily learning GIS, which is, all of us can attest, can be really painful at times. And now that I have some more reps under me, I'm enjoying it more, and comboing it with remote sensing is really good as well. So the aha moment was getting back into it, taking a remote sensing class as a grad student, and then being able to jump onto this project. That's kind of and there's plenty of aha moments with this project as well that we'll jump into later on, because it's been a process for sure. But
I don't know why you wouldn't enjoy having a crashed hard drive. Those are great times. I wonder, you actually, all three of you hit on various aha moments that I've had in my career with GIS, but I'll start again with you, Izaak, since you're right there. You talked about, one of my aha moments was about NDVI and reflectance curves. I wonder if you want to talk about that for a sec.
Yeah, sure. That's cool that you also had that aha moment. I think that was one part of learning about remote sensing that I just thought was so cool. So remote sensing, is a very broad way of looking at it. Technically, your eyes are remote sensors. A camera is a remote sensor, but just to keep it simple, my project uses a satellite as a remote sensor. And there are sensors that can see, within the visible spectrum, what we can see with our human eyes. But there are also sensors that can see things and analyze things beyond what we can see in the visual spectrum. And everything has a reflectance curve that changes depending on where you are in the electromagnetic spectrum. So vegetation, healthy vegetation that is chlorophyll, in the visual, if you have a chart, I wish I could show it. In the visual realm, it peaks a little bit when it's green, and then it dips down in the red. But in the near infrared, it peaks tremendously, and it's pretty fascinating. The study I'm involved with does not dive into it a ton, but each specific species, depending on what wavelength you're on, of plants, has a certain reflectance value. And scientists can take a satellite image, and if they have the right software, they can essentially figure out where species allocations of trees are. You can even, there's even advanced software now to do tree counts or to see what's changed over time. And so on the vegetation side, it's really cool, but it's also cool as well because things like snow have very high reflectance, but things like water have terrible reflectance. So it is kind of a whole other component that I never thought I never even really considered, but as soon as I learned about it, I guess you could say it was an aha moment. Definitely.
Yeah, I thought it was for sure. Just looking at the, that simple comparison, on its face, simple comparison of the various wavelengths that are coming back from a given scene that gives you, that you can basically score and say, what is this that's there on the ground? It's just such powerful technology. Maja, have you had an aha moment with a piece of technology or an approach as you've worked through your career?
Well, I would say that the GIS is one of the tools that just lets you have aha moments all the time. I think within my field, because I work in the digital humanities and I use humanistic sources in GIS, it is much of a aha moment to figure out how to use GIS for humanistic sources. And it's something that scholars are really grappling with, how we can use a technology that is made for numbers and calculations, but still being able to map these qualitative sources in a way that is meaningful to people. And much of the data that we work with is incomplete and it's uncertain. And how do we deal with that? So the hiding suitability analysis, for instance, that I made was a big aha moment for me, that I was able to actually quantify these qualitative sources that I had and have a visual output that makes sense.
That's great, thanks. And James, how about you? And you're on mute, I think, James.
Yeah, no, the aha moment for me was when I was making the lots, I forgot to not use Snapper, the snapping tool. Learning that was very important.
I was going to ask how you determine the lot lines.
If you look at the second slide, you'll have like the base map on my PowerPoint. And that base map, you can see the lines of the paths between the graves. And that's what right now, because there's not a lot of information and there's not, we didn't have the map that they had doesn't show the plots and which way the graves are and where they're located. So I've taken and just mapped out the general outlines of what I would consider a plot with the pathing that's going around them. So like I said, it's still a work in progress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you could. I know I was noticing when I looked at your, I don't know if it was the drone photo or one of the context photos where you could see where I assume where people had walked in between the plots and created paths of their own. Interesting. So now to your specific projects, how did you all come to be involved in these projects? Were they your idea, or did you, or was it someone else's idea? And if it was your idea, how did you think it was going to pan out? And how has it panned out? How has it met your expectations or not? And or even if it was someone else's idea, what did you think you were in for at the beginning, and how has that how have your those thoughts and expectations changed over time? Maybe we can go back to Izaak to start off on that one.
Yeah, so my project was not my idea originally. There is a lot of partnerships that have formed in recent years between institutions within the University of Maine System and institutions with our North Atlantic neighbors. For example, at USM, the Maine North Atlantic Institute exists. At UMO, there's the Arctic Institute. These universities are part of the University Arctic Network. So there's quite a lot of projects going on right now. And this is not the only project in Greenland that's taking place at USM. And a lot has happened previously in Iceland as well. But the way I got involved was early on as a master's student. This started as a research assistantship, and it's just taken off after that. And this is my third semester on it now. Coming from a guy who traditionally was really using GIS for transportation related things, this is pretty different. And I've really fallen in love with landscape analysis. It's not normally what I would have thought a couple of years ago what I'd be interested in, but I've definitely become pretty passionate about it.
And have you been sort of, has this been kind of one continuous analysis throughout the 3 semesters, or are you changing gears every semester, or is it something in between?
A lot of it has been because we have run into so many problems with data acquisition. For example, I spent 1 semester using Landsat imagery, and the amount of problems that came with that was unreal. So MODIS is a relatively new component to this, and we've looked into Aster, and I'll put this out there right now. If anyone has any remote sensing experience and has any sensor ideas, I feel like we've looked at almost all of them, but Greenland seems to have been missed in a lot of parts in the past, surprisingly. But feel free to reach out. I love hearing what people have to say.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, chime in the chat, folks, if you have remote sensing experience. I know Cruz is an expert. I worked with her myself, and but maybe Tony, maybe your guy also. But if other folks are out there, certainly get in touch in the chat so we can make some connections here. Maja, how about you? How did you come to your project, or projects, I should say?
Both of them were actually projects that I made in 2 different GIS classes I took at UMaine. The hiding suitability analysis I made this spring in GIS2 with Tora, and the idea came when we were learning how to make habitat suitability analysis, and we tried to predict the best and worst habitat areas for muskrats and beavers in Maine. And at the same time, I was taking a class on environmental history. And I read some survivor testimonies in that class. And I realized that when they described the hiding places in the forests, they were actually kind of describing a sort of criteria that we also need for habitat suitability analysis. So I thought maybe I could try to combine the two, and that's where the idea came. For the platform I made, I took a GIS class about programming in GIS, and the teacher in that class showed us how, I don't know if you have seen the Johns Hopkins University COVID-19 map, which is the same kind of application where you can click on a country and then you can see how many COVID cases there were. And she showed us that that is possible to do also on your own. So I thought, so that was more my role as a research assistant. I thought that that would be a great way of displaying the data that we have, because we have so many data points. And I think what distinguishes our project from others is the fact that we have a very large scale. And that can be difficult to display, but doing it this way, it is interactive, and it allows users to explore it on their own and to see the different attributes in different ways that you choose yourself.
Great. And James, how did you arrive at this project? And as kind of a side note, where is Wytopitlock? I hope I said that right. I did a quick search and saw that that's 82 miles from UMaine Presque Isle, and so I'm curious to know how you landed on that particular project.
All right, so it was a suggestion from my professor for the GIS course, Dr. Wong, and it was due to the fact that I live half the distance between Wytopitlock and Umpney, and I think it's an hour 47 minutes from Presque Isle, and a lot of students up there wouldn't want to make the travel down and make the travel back. And I figured, why not? Like I said, it'd be a good service to the community. So I chose to pick that subject versus the other subjects that he had, and got that. And it's located, like you said, 82 miles south of Presque Isle, down Route 1, off to Route 2A, and then off of Route 2A onto 171 is the exact mapping route from Presque Isle.
Yeah, I think for those of us in the southern part of the state, we think, that's not particularly close by, and so it must have been a little bit of an effort to get there. But I guess if you were halfway already, maybe it's not so bad. Oh
yeah, no, it wasn't bad at all.
Yeah. Interesting. So I wanted to change gears a tiny bit and go back to Maja for a second and say that I was first of all, I wanted to compliment you on the maps of the hiding places. Those are done to a really high standard, and I hope that everybody, especially students on the call, will take a moment to go and view Maja's presentation and look at those, and view the video in high def on YouTube and pause and take a look at those maps. They're really, really well done. So that's a little bit of a side note. But I wanted to say also that I was really struck with your map, your ArcGIS Online, your interactive app showing concentration camps and ghettos, and I was struck at the scale of it, in quite an emotional way, and it occurred to me, and I started thinking about all three projects, and and realize that these all of your projects together, the 3 projects, they represent very human stories in a way that the GIS work doesn't always. I work, for instance, I work at a utility, so I'm very concerned with where stuff is, and or you may work for a company doing logistics or something, and so while there are people in my company who do interact more closely with people and do have exposure to real world stories of people, that's not what I do so often. And so, but among your 3 projects, it's about, you cover the changing landscape where people are living their lives. You're talking about places where people were persecuted and incarcerated and killed, and also about their final resting places. And so I'm curious to know about the projects as you got into the projects and you started working with the stakeholders involved. Who were those people, and how did those interactions with those people go as you worked on your projects? And maybe Maja, we can start with you again.
Well, actually, I didn't really work with any stakeholders in my projects. I think that has a lot to do with the fact that I work with historical data or a historic period, and in comparison to working with present day problems that you have to solve in GIS, which is often used for. But I will say that we have recently, as of last week, reached out to the people who have published the encyclopedia that we have digitized for the project. All of the points you see, all of the data attached is a digitalization of an encyclopedia. And it's published by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, USHMM, in Washington, D.C. And we have asked them whether they would be interested in collaboration. And they are really interested. And I think it's the first time we show them some work that they actually can see. I'm talking about the platform, that they can see as part of their own work. So that will be definitely a future collaborator on it. But it's also intended to be used as teaching material. So we're going to keep developing it, and we want to, maybe it will be making different versions of the platform for different audiences, for scholars, but also for high school students or for different universities. So we are writing guides and manuals on how to use the platform, and that means that in the future, that will possibly change the way that the platform is, but it will also be a variety of different people that we are going to be working with, such as universities and high schools.
That's interesting. I was going to ask who the target audience was, and I hadn't really thought that the platform offers you a lot of flexibility to tailor things for a variety of different audiences. So that's really handy. Yeah. James, who did you work with on your project on the ground? I think you mentioned a town manager, and were there other folks involved?
It was pretty much me, Dr. Wong, and Dr. Wong was communicating back and forth with the town manager, who was able to facilitate a map, but the map was more of a pixel map instead of a square pixel map instead of a map. It wasn't really usable for what we wanted to make. But yeah, no, it was the town manager that we were working with. I
see. So did you start by trying to take their hand-drawn map and georeference it, place it on the
we couldn't georeference the hand-drawn map. It was more of it's like you took a shoot, how can I explain it? Actually, something like that.
Oh, I see.
And it was just left side, right side, and there was no upper level. Because if you see, when you look at the map on my presentation, you'll notice that there's a top part, and then there's a middle to the left, and then there's middle to the right. There's 3 sections, and their map only covered 2 sections, but we didn't have the grave names on the maps that we were working with. but it was on theirs. So we have to go back and collect that data in order to reference their map to it.
I see. Yeah. And Izaak, who are the stakeholders on your project?
Yeah, that's an interesting question for my specific project. A couple of things I can say is, I have not been to Greenland, so it is a little strange because I feel like I know this place so well, a year and change into it. But Dr. Kruse has, and other members of USM, and relationships have been built. And then on top of that, kind of the main goal from the forefront is that for this study is that we will be able to give it to the local population. That's really important. We want to be able to share it with them and have it be a part of whatever decision-making process there is, because resiliency planning is a thing that everyone has to consider now, especially in the Arctic. So, keeping that angle in mind is definitely a part of the forefront. And, one part of the study that we haven't gotten to yet is working with the locals specifically. We want to incorporate that some way. And I was really impressed with your project, Maja, because of the humanity side of it. And, although this is a little different, you have given me some unique perspectives on how to incorporate, human data, because that is really important here. And I'm thinking, specifically, for example, for, the sheep farming population in the future, we might have show things on the maps that we create, but, their experiences in previous years and what they have dealt with is really important to consider as well. So I just thought it was really cool the way that you, incorporated everything into both of your projects.
Great, thanks for that. So I'm watching the clock tick away, and I had tons of questions for you all, and so I'm going to race through one, and then we'll get to some viewer questions, if that's all right. So I wanted to, just a little comment that the field of GIS, we have a really strong tradition, I think, of peer-to-peer knowledge sharing. So we learn by and large from each other, online and in discussions and at conferences, and we share successes and sometimes failures. And one of the questions that I want to invite you to share with each other in that tradition, and I have a number of questions that I really like here, but I'll ask you this one. What is of the 3 projects that you've participated in, or 4 if we count both of Maja's projects, what's a piece of your project that you think you may offer to one of the other panelists today as a nice fit in their project, and vice versa? What do you see in one of the other projects that you might want to know a little bit more about? And let's go with Maja. We'll start with Maja there.
Well, I would say that James's use of drones is extremely fascinating, and that's something that I can only hope to be able to do in the future somehow. And I think within my field of study, it is definitely something that could be relevant within environmental history of the Holocaust. It is an object to look at the landscape as it is today, to look for traces of the Holocaust. And a tragic example of that is that crops in fields in Eastern Europe have shown to change color if there are human remains in the soil. So by looking at the soil composition, it actually changes the vegetation in the area. There's a Holocaust scholar who calls it a necrosol when the soil changes, but it also changes the vegetation. And then some scholars argue that we should teach or treat these areas that we often don't know exist, because there were so many areas of mass murder in Eastern Europe that we don't know the existence or presence or locations of. But we should treat these areas as memorials, but as nature's memorials in a way. So we can look for these traces in the environment. And I'm thinking that drone technology in that regard could be very interesting to see, is there something out of the ordinary in these areas to look into to help identify these hidden places.
And how about something that you've employed in your project that you think may be useful to one of the other panelists?
I think that this suitability analysis, as I said, it was an aha moment for me to learn about it. And I think that that is something that can be used in many different projects. But I think also just as Izaak was talking about before, incorporating qualitative sources in work. Instead of only working with numbers and calculations, actually being able to incorporate the voices of people in the areas that we study, because we all study areas. That's what we do in geography and GIS. So that is just one way of quantifying qualitative sources. And there's some interesting questions there to go into.
Yeah, great advice. James, something you could use, something you can share?
I agree. I would love to share the drone flights and stuff, because I think that would work for both groups, or both of you guys. And I think that it would allow for easy access, because they do have drones that can go pretty high. And with that, you can do large area scanning of an aerial view photography of the sites. But yeah, that's something I would love to share. The thing that I would love to gain, the modeling. I'm not good at making models on ArcGIS, and the roster calculator. I just learned some of it in one of our labs that we just had, but that roster calculator, using it to analyze I think you said it was the wavelength of the plants from a satellite. Sounds very intriguing, like really intriguing to me.
Those are both very powerful tools. Yeah. And I'm sure they fall in my aha list somewhere. Yeah. Izaak, how about you?
Yeah, well, James, to echo Maja, James's use of a drone is really interesting. I'm actually taking a drone mapping class right now, and I've just been completely blown away by its applicability in the photogrammetry software that comes with it. I think it's just such a powerful tool, and it would be so interesting because MODIS data is 250 meter resolution. That's 820 feet by 820 feet. It's not that great. And drone imagery, if you were to theoretically pick a specific part of Kuyata and really dive into it, there would be some fascinating results. As far as offering, it is interesting because it is a vegetation analysis, but both of the projects are, looking at landscape in some way, and utilizing some sort of remote sensing technique. This could be completely wrong, but in Maja's instance, for her model, it may be better fleshing out the forest with like an unsupervised classification or something like that. Might add another story, or James further strengthening his project with a certain remote sensing technique, I think would be really powerful, because what I'm doing is remote sensing at the end of the day.
I actually did use a remote sensing technique to digitize the historical map. I tried to use that unsupervised method. Tora, correct me if I'm wrong, but I used the software to teach it the different classifications of objects on the map, to try to extract each individual building on the map. And it worked really well, I would say, but I also had to do a lot of cleanup afterwards to remove all the buildings on the historical, it was a topographic map, were black, but all the place names were also black. And so it took some of the place names also out of that, which I had to remove afterwards.
Very cool.
Yeah, interesting use. Well, let's turn to some listener questions, viewer questions. We had a number of questions for Maja, and Eileen has been consolidating these, so I'll do my best to read these off. What sources or historical maps or data sets have you used to try to recreate the landscapes of Nazi Germany to better understand how people would have moved or hidden at that time? And are the historical maps and spatial data adequate for your work, or are they lacking, and how so? I was curious to add to that question. I imagine the landscape has changed quite a lot in the years since the war, and I wonder how that affected your work.
Yeah, I digitized 2 historical maps, topographic maps for the project, one from 1934 and one from 1938. And the events took place around 1940 to 1943. So it was relatively close to the events. And that was very important for forest extent, for instance, because forest extent is something that changes a lot over the course of 70, 80 years. It was not as important in regard to topography, because elevation doesn't really change a lot. I could have digitized some contour lines, but I chose to work with a present day DEM model. But all of the other information I got from topographic maps, also digitizing roads. Very important also to know which roads were connecting the ghettos. Usually many of the settlements had ghettos in them. And what I then found out, the question was something about how it says something about how the Nazis used the environment. And of course, the topographic maps don't say anything about that, but they say something about how the relation between the features in the area. So I had to also combine that information with reading the encyclopedia, for instance, or reading other sources that were saying something about how the Germans would be traveling from ghetto to ghetto, or they would force Jewish people out on forced marshes or to forced labor sites. And that all of those things increased the perpetrator activity in the area, which is something that I included in the model by saying a good hiding place can't be close to this, because it would increase the discovery chances.
Well, how did you translate close into a number?
That's a very good question, and that is something that I have decided completely. Survivors in their testimonies or memoirs don't say within 500 meters off. So I had to decide what I thought, and I did that by looking at the relation between the features, and in a way, I guess what I would think. It was trying to figure out that, and that is probably something that is not so good thing about the model, because it's based on what I think would be close and far and so on. But it's also these parameters in the model are easy to change. So if it is revealed at some point that the distances were different, I just change those things and make a new output, and then I have a new map. So that's a part of quantifying qualitative resources. It's necessary to make those decisions.
Mm-hmm. We have a comment here that says modeling is an art, and yeah, that's a good comment, I think. James, what was the resolution of your drone photo, and was it a single photo for cemetery, or did you have several stitched together?
Originally, we were that's a good point. I had a originally we had planned to do a stitching of multiple photos using a drone pathing, and for some reason the program didn't take the photos when it was supposed to, so we didn't get that part, but which resulted in us using the single shot photo, which you can see is shot directly over. I think there's like a line, almost like a cross on top of one of the stones that you can the headstones that you can actually see with it. And I think it was a 20 megapixel high def 20 megapixel, because you can get within like an inch or 3 inches of the ground and actually see really good resolution with the camera from where it was.
That's pretty amazing resolution.
Yeah.
Let's see, Izaak. I was interested in the analysis that you came up with, where you seem to be seeing some increase in vegetation in inland areas, which I would think would be closer to the glacier, versus along the coast, where you think you might have more temperate waters and now warming waters. Now, I think if you were to ask me, I would have expected to see a more robust increase in vegetation along the coast than inland. Do you have some kind of understanding, or what's your understanding of the pattern that you're seeing there?
Yeah, it does seem counterintuitive. Well, what I will say is this. What I'm saying is a speculation, of course, but I think part of it has to do with me using an example during the height of the growing season. What we have found over 20 years is that our May dates are showing significant change pretty much across the board. If I was to show you that raster calculator image, it would be almost red everywhere. September is pretty similar increase. July actually stays relatively steady. And that might be a limitation with the NDVI, because we were capturing what we call max NDVI, which that could change slightly. It might be not the best selection of the year. It might be different if we picked a different 16-day resolution. But as far as inland near the glacier, there's a phenomenon happening in the Arctic called shrubification. And essentially there's these invasive shrubs that are growing like crazy. And if I were to guess, it would be a component to what we're seeing in kind of the inland areas. As far as the coast, I really don't have a good answer for that. I think, this is why it's so important to study the climate. It's always such a complex story. And if we were to, if I read, it could be we're just capturing 2 points in time, and I don't have climate data, included in this specific example. So there's a lot of different things going on, and it's all speculative, of course.
Yeah, I was thinking an animation might be interesting at some point in the analysis, although you probably would want a lot more steps in your times, or a lot more intervals within each year, within each piece of the time series.
Yeah, that's
to make that idea compelling.
That's a good idea. We have maps for each part of the growing season for all 21 years. So we have that done. And that would be an interesting way to look at it. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to see it anyway. I don't know if anyone else would, but yeah, so let me know if you do that. We had another one for Maja. A lot of folks want to know how you found sources for forest survivor accounts, the accounts of folks who survived by hiding in the forest.
That's also always one of the difficult things. The accounts that I found, I did through an article I read. It's called "Nature Was Helping Us" by Tim Cole, and I looked at the source. So he is writing about the life of forest fugitives during the Holocaust, and I looked at the sources that he used and read some of those accounts. I also, in my study area, there was one of the ghettos in the middle of the study area, Starachovice-Virbsnik, is one of the biggest Holocaust historians. Christopher Browning has written a book about the fate of the Jewish population in that ghetto. And he has a chapter in his book about escapees. And through his chapter, I found an account of a person. If you look at my final map, you can see on the left side, I have some quotes from survivor testimonies. And the two upper quotes in that are from David Sarli, who was incarcerated in this ghetto. And then he escaped from, or he was in a work camp. And he describes how he has had to cross a river to get into the southern parts of the woods, which also allowed me to, and then he said he and 47 other people lived there, and they acquired food from a little village called Ratkovic, which I then was able to locate on the historical map and in my study area, which meant I could also test the model with his testimony because I could locate him in the forest. But the last good, so that's a good way of finding sources. The other good source is the Showa Foundation. If you're familiar with the Showa Foundation, made by Steven Spielberg in the 90s to collect video testimonies of Holocaust survivors. About 50,000 interviews were collected. And you can access some of these interviews online for free if you create an account. And all of those, most of those interviews are indexed, which means you can go in and search for indexing terms. You can, for instance, search for a specific river, a specific forest, or rivers in general, and so on. And then it shows you exactly which minute in the testimonies that the description appears. So that's another source.
Thank you for that. And we had one more question. I think we'll let this be the last one. We have Doreen's asking James. She's also building, I'm sorry, I hope she is appropriate. Also building a map of cemeteries in Acton, Maine, for my final project in GIS1. Your work with the drone to map out the plots was amazing. How long did it take you to map out those plots?
It took, got to think here for a second. There was a couple late nighters. I think total, it took me about 5 hours to get the plots mapped. And then I realized I didn't have snapping on, and I had to go back through and snap every single plot together, which if you haven't done that, it is very tedious because you're at 1-to-1 ratio, getting those corners together and making sure they're not overlapping each other. And I think there was like, there was over 200 points overlapping. So yeah, that was a fun couple, I want to say about 6 or 7 hours total of work on that.
I'm laughing with you, not at you.
Oh no, I totally understand. No,
A lot of us have been there.
That.
Yeah.
Yeah, that snapping tool, if it's not on when you're doing stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're in for some painstaking work.
Or if it snaps to the wrong thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's all great info. Thank you so much for presenting tonight. I have tons more questions. I imagine that those watching may as well. If you look in the chat, Eileen has put a a link to the Maine Geospatial Institute, where you can find out more information about tonight's event and hopefully get in touch. So if you have suggestions for the panelists or you want more info from the panelists, reach out to MGI via that link, and hopefully we can help you make the right connections there. And I want to thank everybody. Thank our panelists, James Dobbs, Izaak, Onos, Maja, Cruz. Thank you so much for coming and talking tonight. And thank you all at home or at work for tuning in. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you, and thank you for hosting.
Yeah, thank you, Andy.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Good night.